Please don't let him come back. The voice was so faint, I almost thought it came from my own imagination, the kind that creeps in when a house is too quiet and the night stretches longer than it should. I had only come to Victor's place because something about the silence felt wrong. My brother loved noise, music, people, movement, the kind of chaos that proved he was alive. But tonight the house sat still under the pale glow of the porch light, like it was holding its breath. I pushed the front door open and the hinges whispered across the marble entryway, the sound echoing farther than it should in a home this big. The air smelled faintly metallic, mixed with the cold damp scent that old basements tend to collect. I stood there for a moment, listening. No music, no television, no footsteps upstairs. Just the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere down the hall and the distant rattle of pipes inside the walls. That was when I heard it again. A soft dragging sound, metal brushing against concrete. My jaw tightened as I followed the noise toward the back of the house where a narrow stairwell disappeared into the lower level. Victor had bought this place 2 years ago, a modern build outside the city with too much square footage and not enough warmth. He said he liked the privacy, said the neighbors minded their own business. At the time, I thought that was the point. Now, standing at the top of those stairs, I wondered what else he liked about it. Each step creaked under my weight as I descended, the overhead bulb flickering once before settling into a dull yellow glow. The basement stretched wider than I expected, unfinished concrete walls, exposed beams, the kind of space meant for storage or maybe a home gym. But what stopped me cold was the sound of breathing. Quiet, shallow, human. I turned slowly toward the far corner where the shadows gathered thickest. That was when I saw her. A young woman sat against one of the support columns with a length of chain looped around the pipe behind her. Her wrists were bound in front of her, the metal slack enough for movement, but not enough for escape. She looked up when the light hit my face, and the fear in her eyes was the kind you don't forget. Her hair hung loosely around her shoulders, her expression pale, but alert like someone who had been waiting for footsteps that never came. For a second, we just stared at each other, the silence between us louder than anything else in that basement. Then she spoke again, her voice trembling but clear enough to cut straight through my chest. "Please," she whispered, pulling the chain slightly as if testing whether it would hold. "If you're one of his friends, I swear I won't tell anyone anything." I felt something inside me go still. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something heavier. Because there was only one person who owned this house. My brother Victor. And as the faint rattle of that chain echoed across the concrete floor, I realized I had just walked into a part of his life he never meant for me to see. I did not move for a long moment. The basement light hummed softly above us, casting a dull circle across the concrete floor. And inside that circle sat the girl who clearly believed I was the next problem she had to survive. Her eyes tracked every small motion I made, the way a person watches a storm rolling closer on the horizon. I noticed how carefully she held herself, shoulders tense, wrists angled slightly inward as though she had spent hours trying to find the smallest bit of slack in the chain. The metal links scraped faintly when she shifted, a dry sound that echoed through the empty basement. I took one slow step forward and she instantly pulled back, the chain tightening with a soft clink. "Do not come closer," she said quickly, her voice thin but steady in that stubborn way people use when fear is the only thing keeping them upright. "If Victor sent you down here, just tell him I already told him everything I know." Hearing my brother's name in that quiet room made the air feel heavier. I stopped where I was and studied her more carefully. She looked to be in her mid-20s, maybe a little younger, the kind of person who probably did not belong anywhere near a house like this. There were faint marks of exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that come from too many sleepless hours rather than injury, and the sleeves of her sweater hung loose around her wrists where the chain rested. I forced my voice to stay calm. "Victor did not send me," I said. The words sounded strange even to me, as though the house itself did not believe them. She blinked once, then again, as if trying to decide whether that was a trick. "That is not funny," she whispered. "He always says that first." I exhaled slowly and ran a hand through my hair, glancing around the basement, as if the walls might explain something my brother never had. A folding table stood against the far wall with a half-empty bottle of water and a lamp that had not been turned on. Boxes lined the opposite side of the room, neatly stacked like someone had planned the space carefully. Nothing about it looked accidental. Nothing about it looked temporary. That realization settled in my chest like a stone. I turned back toward her. "Listen to me," I said quietly. "My name is Adrian Romano." The reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened in recognition. Not relief, but something closer to shock. She knew the name. Most people in the city did. For a second, the chain slipped from her fingers and rattled lightly against the pipe behind her. "You are his brother," she said. It was not a question. I nodded once. The silence that followed stretched so long I could hear the faint ticking of the thermostat upstairs. She lowered her gaze to the concrete floor, as if that confirmed everything she had feared. "Then it does not matter," she murmured. "You are all the same." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of someone who had already made peace with disappointment. I felt a sharp flicker of something unfamiliar behind my ribs, something uncomfortably close to shame. I had spent years building a reputation that made men twice my size step aside in crowded rooms. But standing in that basement, facing someone who looked at me like the final door closing, that reputation suddenly felt different. I crouched slowly, so I was not towering over her. The chain scraped again when she instinctively leaned away. "What is your name?" I asked. She hesitated, studying my face as if searching for a hidden angle to the question. Finally, she answered. "Emily," she said quietly. "Emily Carter." The name lingered in the air between us. Ordinary. Familiar. The kind of name you would expect to see on a college diploma or a mailbox in a quiet neighborhood. Not chained to a pipe in my brother's basement. "Emily," I repeated, letting the syllables settle. Then I looked down at the metal link wrapped around the pipe and felt the cold certainty growing stronger in my chest. Because whatever Victor thought he was doing here, whatever story he had told himself to justify it, one thing had already become clear. My brother had crossed a line that I'd spent my entire life making sure no one in my world ever crossed. And upstairs, somewhere in the quiet house above us, I heard the faint sound of a car, door closing. I did not need to see the driveway to know who had just arrived. Victor always closed a car, door the same way. Not a careless slam, but a firm, deliberate click that carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed every place he entered already belonged to him. The sound traveled faintly through the floor above us, followed by the muffled echo of footsteps crossing the hardwood in the entry hall. Emily heard it too. Her entire body went still, shoulders tightening as if every muscle had memorized that sound. The chain shifted slightly in her hands, and the small metallic scrape seemed suddenly too loud in the still basement air. Her eyes snapped back to mine, wide with the kind of urgency that does not need explanation. "He is back," she whispered. The words barely carried across the few feet between us, but the meaning hit harder than any raised voice. I remained crouched where I was, listening to the rhythm of movement above us. A coat being dropped somewhere near the door. The soft creak of the staircase railing. Victor was not rushing. Victor never rushed. That was the part that bothered me most. Someone who moved slowly in a moment like this already believed the situation was under control. Emily pulled the chain slightly closer to her chest, as if trying to make herself smaller against the support column. "You should go upstairs," she said quickly, the words tumbling over each other in quiet desperation. "If he finds you down here with me, he will think I told you something." I studied her face for a second, noticing the way her eyes flicked toward the ceiling with every faint step. Above us. She was not exaggerating. She had learned to measure time by the sound of his footsteps. That realization settled heavily in my mind. "Emily," I said quietly. She shook her head before I could finish. "Please just leave," she insisted. "If he thinks I try to get help, it will only make things worse." I followed her gaze upward as another step sounded across the floor above us, slower this time, moving toward the hallway that led to the basement door. Victor had always preferred to inspect things personally. Even when we were children, he had that habit of checking every room, every corner, making sure the world stayed arranged exactly the way he wanted it. I stood slowly, my knees straightening as I glanced again at the chain wrapped around the pipe behind her. The metal looked new, not something improvised in panic, something placed here intentionally, carefully, the kind of decision that does not happen by accident. "How long have you been here?" I asked. Emily hesitated, her lips pressing together as though the number itself felt dangerous to say aloud. Finally, she answered in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. 3 days. The number hung in the air between us. 3 days in a basement with no windows and only the sound of footsteps above you to measure the passing hours. I nodded once, filing that information away, and turned toward the staircase just as the faint click of a door opening echoed through the ceiling above us. Victor was heading this way. Emily's breath caught sharply when she heard it. "You should go," she repeated, her voice trembling now. "You do not understand what he will do if he thinks I talked." I looked back at her one last time before stepping toward the bottom of the stairs. The fear in her expression had not changed. In her mind, nothing about this situation had improved simply because I was standing here instead of my brother. To her, I was still part of the same world that had put that chain around the pipe. And maybe she was not wrong. But as the basement door above creaked slowly open and the light from the hallway spilled down the staircase, one thing became painfully clear to me. Whatever Victor had planned for Emily Carter, he had never planned for me to find out. The basement door opened slowly above me, the hinges releasing a long, tired creak that drifted down the stairwell like a warning. A rectangle of warm light spilled across the steps, cutting through the dim yellow glow of the basement bulb. I remained where I stood at the bottom of the staircase, listening to the familiar rhythm of footsteps beginning their descent. Victor never hurried. Each step landed with quiet confidence, measured and deliberate, the way someone moves when they expect everything in front of them to remain exactly where they left it. Behind me, I heard the faint rattle of the chain as Emily instinctively pulled it closer, the sound small but sharp against the concrete walls. I did not turn around. I did not need to see her face to know the fear had returned to her eyes. Victor appeared halfway down the stairs a moment later, one hand resting casually on the railing, his expression relaxed in the way people look when they are walking into a room they believe they control. His dark coat hung loosely over one shoulder, and a set of car keys spun slowly around his finger. For a brief second, he simply stared at me, surprise flickering across his face like a light turning on in a dark room. Then he smiled. "Adrian," he said, the name rolling out in a tone that sounded almost amused. "You are a long way from your side of the city." His gaze moved past me toward the far corner of the basement, and I saw the exact moment he realized Emily was no longer alone down here. The smile faded, not dramatically, just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. Victor stepped down the last 2 stairs and stopped beside me, glancing around the basement as though trying to understand how this small, unexpected detail had appeared inside his otherwise orderly evening. "You should have called first," he continued calmly. "I would have made sure the house was ready for company." I studied my brother in silence for a moment. Victor had always looked like the more approachable one between us. Softer voice, easier smile. People trusted him faster. It was a talent he had used his entire life. But standing here now, I noticed something different in the way his eyes kept shifting toward the support column behind me. He was not worried that I had arrived. He was worried about what I had already seen. "What is this?" I asked finally, keeping my voice level. Victor followed my line of sight toward the chain wrapped around the pipe. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he let out a quiet breath and rubbed the back of his neck as if the situation were merely inconvenient rather than serious. "That," he said slowly, "is a complication." The word hung in the air between us. Behind me, Emily did not move. She had become perfectly still again, like someone who knew any sudden sound might draw attention she did not want. Victor glanced at her briefly before looking back at me. "She is not supposed to be part of your evening," he added. I folded my arms across my chest. 3 days, I said. Victor's expression tightened slightly. "What?" She said she has been down here for 3 days. Victor looked mildly annoyed, the way a person reacts when someone reveals information out of turn. "Emily," he said without turning around, his voice calm but firm, We talked about unnecessary conversations. The words were not loud, but they carried the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. I watched the exchange carefully, noticing how Emily lowered her gaze even though she had not moved an inch. Victor finally turned back toward me, exhaling again as if the entire scene were something he had hoped to avoid explaining tonight. "Listen," he said, stepping a little closer. "This situation is temporary." I did not respond. Victor gestured casually toward the corner. "She saw something she was not supposed to see," he continued. "Nothing dramatic, just the wrong place at the wrong time." His tone remained light, conversational, the same tone he used during business dinners when negotiating deals worth millions of dollars. "So you chained her to a pipe?" I said. Victor frowned slightly, as if that description were unnecessarily harsh. "I secured the situation," he corrected. The difference between those two sentences sat heavily in the quiet basement. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victor leaned back against the railing and gave me a tired look. "Adrian," he said quietly, "you know how our world works." I held his gaze. No women, no children. The rule had existed long before either of us were old enough to enforce it. It was the one line I had never allowed anyone in our organization to cross. Victor looked at me for a long second. Then he glanced once more toward Emily before shaking his head slowly. "You are making this bigger than it is," he replied. Upstairs the house remained perfectly silent, but down in the basement something between the two of us had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Victor's words hung in the basement like cold air that refused to move. "You are making this bigger than it is." I looked at him for a long moment, studying the familiar face that had shared my childhood kitchen table, the same face that had once followed me around when we were boys, asking questions about everything in the world. For a second, I wondered when exactly that boy had disappeared. Maybe he had never really been there at all. Behind me, I heard the faint scrape of chain again as Emily shifted her hands, the small sound reminding both of us that she was still part of this conversation, whether Victor liked it or not. Victor sighed, as though the entire situation had become inconvenient. "Adrian," he said patiently, "this is temporary. I only needed time to sort out a problem." I did not look away from him. "A person is not a problem," I said quietly. Victor gave a small, humorless laugh. "Everything is a problem if it can ruin 10 years of careful work." He gestured vaguely toward the corner of the basement where Emily Saturday, she saw something she should not have seen. That is all. I remained silent, letting the quiet stretch between us. Victor had always hated silence. It forced him to fill the space with explanations he had not planned to give. "You remember the warehouse on the South Docks?" he continued after a moment. "The one we shut down last winter." I nodded slightly. The place had been empty by the time we arrived, abandoned before anyone could ask questions. Victor watched my face carefully. "She was there," he said. I felt the weight of his meaning settle in slowly. Not a participant, not a partner, a witness. My gaze drifted briefly toward Emily. She had not spoken again since Victor appeared, but I could feel her attention fixed on every word. "So you chained her in your basement," I said. Victor rubbed his temples like someone trying to explain a simple concept to a stubborn child. "I secured the situation until I could decide what to do," he repeated. "There are people involved who would react badly if they thought a witness was walking around free." I took a slow breath. "Then you should have brought the situation to me." Victor shook his head immediately. "No," he said firmly, "because you would have done exactly what you are doing right now." He pointed toward the pipe behind me, without even looking. "You would have turned this into a moral debate." The words landed harder than he intended. For years, Victor had accepted the rules I enforced in our organization without question. They kept chaos out of our business. They kept innocent people out of our world. Until tonight, I had believed he respected that line as much as I did. "The rules exist for a reason," I said quietly. Victor leaned against the railing again, his patience fading slightly. "The rules exist because they make you feel better about the work we do," he replied. "But sometimes the world is not that simple." Behind me, Emily spoke suddenly, her voice small but steady. I did not want to ruin anyone's work. Both of us turned toward her at the same time. She looked up carefully, meeting Victor's eyes first. "I told you already," she said. I will not go to the police. I will not talk to anyone. I just want to go home. Victor watched her with the distant expression of someone studying a puzzle. Then he looked back at me. You see, he said softly, even she understands the situation. I did not move for several seconds. The basement light flickered once overhead, the faint buzz filling the silence. Finally, I stepped past Victor and walked toward the support column. Emily tensed instantly, unsure what I intended to do. The chain glinted dull silver under the yellow light as I crouched beside the pipe and examined the lock securing it. Victor straightened behind me. Adrian, he said slowly, a warning threading through his voice. I ignored him and tested the metal with my hand. It was solid, but not complicated. The kind of lock meant to delay someone, not stop them forever. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the small key ring I carried everywhere. Behind me, Victor's tone sharpened. Do not do this. I glanced back at him calmly. You broke the rule, I said. Victor took a step forward, his expression tightening. You do not understand the consequences. I slid one of the thin keys into the lock and turned it gently until the mechanism clicked open. The chain fell slack with a soft metallic sound that echoed through the basement. Emily stared at the loosened link in disbelief, her hands frozen around it as though she expected it to snap back at any moment. I stood slowly and looked at my brother across the quiet concrete floor. Now we will deal with the consequences together. The sound of the lock releasing seemed louder than it should have been. For a second, nobody moved. The loose chain slid slowly down the pipe and settled against the concrete floor with a soft metallic echo that carried through the basement like a quiet announcement that something had changed. Emily stared at the open link in her hands, as if she did not quite believe it was real. Her fingers tightened around the cold metal, but she did not stand yet. 3 days of fear does not disappear in a single second. Behind me, Victor exhaled sharply. You should not have done that, he said. His voice was no longer patient. It was careful now, measured in the same way a person speaks when they're trying to stop a situation from slipping out of their control. I straightened slowly and turned toward him. Victor's eyes flicked once toward the broken chain before settling back on my face. The basement light hummed above us, filling the silence between us with that steady electric buzz. She is leaving, I said calmly. Victor shook his head once, the movement small but firm. You are making a mistake, he replied. You think this is about compassion, but it is about risk. He gestured toward Emily without looking at her. There are people who will not be as understanding as you. I held his gaze. Then they will deal with me. For a moment, Victor said nothing. He studied me the way someone studies a chessboard after realizing the game has taken an unexpected turn. Finally, he sighed and stepped back slightly, running a hand through his hair. You always did enjoy dramatic gestures, he said quietly. But you are not the one who will. Spend the next 6 months cleaning up the consequences. I did not respond. Instead, I crouched beside Emily again. She still had not moved from the column, the loose chain lying across her lap like something she had forgotten how to remove. Emily, I said gently. She looked up slowly. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion. Disbelief. You can stand, I said. She hesitated for a second longer, then carefully pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting too long, and she steadied herself against the column before taking a cautious step forward. The chain slipped completely free and fell to the floor behind her with a dull clatter. The sound made Victor glance over his shoulder. This is a bad idea, he muttered under his breath. Emily kept her distance from both of us, standing near the edge of the light, as if she was still unsure which direction meant safety. She looked at me first, then at Victor, clearly trying to understand what had just happened. You said I could go home, she said quietly. Victor gave a tired smile that did not reach his eyes. I said I would think about it. I stood and stepped slightly in front of her without making it obvious. She is leaving, I repeated. Victor's gaze hardened. For a moment, the two of us simply stared at each other across the basement floor. The quiet tension between brothers, far more complicated than any argument between strangers. Finally, Victor let out a slow breath and lifted both hands slightly in surrender. Fine, he said. Take her. The words came easily, but there was calculation behind them. I knew Victor well enough to hear it. He was not agreeing because he approved. He was agreeing because he had already begun planning the next move. I turned back toward Emily. "Come with me," I said. She did not argue. She simply nodded once and followed as I walked toward the staircase. Each step upward felt strangely louder than before. The wooden stairs creaked softly under our weight, while the basement behind us fell quiet again. Victor remained at the bottom, leaning against the railing, watching us go with the distant expression of someone memorizing a moment he intended to revisit later. Halfway up the stairs, Emily paused and glanced back down into the basement. The chain still lay on the floor beneath the light, a dull circle of metal that had held her there only minutes earlier. Victor noticed her looking and offered a small, polite wave, as though she were a guest leaving a dinner party. She turned away immediately and continued climbing. When we reached the top of the stairs, the air upstairs felt warmer, the house suddenly too quiet again. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway. Emily stopped beside me near the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" she asked. I looked toward the basement door behind us where Victor still stood out of sight below the stairs. Then I reached for my coat and opened the front door to the cold night air outside. "Because my brother forgot the rule," I said quietly, "and someone had to remember it." I closed the front door behind us, and the quiet night air wrapped around the house like a blanket that had been waiting for someone to disturb it. The driveway lights cast long, pale lines across the pavement, and for the first time since I walked into that basement, I noticed how cold it actually was outside. Emily stepped onto the porch slowly, as if the open space felt unfamiliar after hours beneath concrete walls. She paused near the top step and looked out toward the dark street beyond the trees. The wind moved lightly through the branches, and the sound made her shoulders tense before she realized what it was. I watched the reaction without saying anything. When a person has spent days listening for footsteps, every sound takes a moment to become normal again. "My car is down the road," I said finally. "We will drive somewhere safe." Emily nodded, but did not move right away. Her eyes drifted back toward the front door behind us. For a second, I thought she might expect Victor to appear again, leaning casually in the doorway, with that quiet smile he used when he wanted people to forget how carefully he watched everything. But the house remained silent. The lights inside glowed faintly through the windows, and nothing moved. She stepped down onto the driveway beside me and wrapped her arms loosely around herself against the cold. The gravel crunched softly beneath our shoes as we walked toward the black sedan parked near the end of the driveway. Halfway there, she spoke again. "He said I saw something," she said quietly. I glanced toward her. "At the warehouse." Emily nodded slowly. "I was delivering files for the accounting firm I work for. The building next door had the wrong address number on the door. I walked inside by mistake." Her voice stayed calm, but the memory was clearly still fresh in her mind. There were trucks inside and several men arguing about shipments. I realized immediately I was not supposed to be there. She looked down at the ground as we reached the car. Victor noticed me before I could leave. I unlocked the passenger door, and she hesitated before getting inside, as if the simple act of entering a vehicle again felt strangely complicated after everything that had happened. Once she settled into the seat, she rested her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead through the windshield. I walked around to the driver's side and started the engine. The quiet hum of the car filled the silence between us. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke while the vehicle rolled slowly down the long driveway toward the empty road. Finally, Emily turned her head slightly toward me. "You said there was a rule," she said. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. "There is, and your brother ignored it." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment after that, studying the dashboard lights as though they might help her understand the strange line that had just appeared between two brothers inside that basement. "What happens now?" she asked. I let the question sit for a second before answering. "Now you disappear for a while," I said. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere nobody connected to Victor will think to look." Emily frowned slightly. "I have a job, an apartment, a normal life." The word normal sounded almost fragile in the car. I nodded slowly. "You still will," I replied. "Just not tonight." She looked out the passenger window at the dark highway stretching ahead of us. The city lights glowed faintly on the horizon about 15 miles away, a soft orange halo above the buildings. "Your brother is not going to forget this," she said quietly. I allowed a small breath to escape. "No," I agreed. "He is not." The car continued forward through the empty road while the house behind us faded into darkness. After a minute, Emily spoke again, her voice softer than before. "You helped me even though you knew that." I glanced at her briefly before returning my attention to the road. The wind moved gently across the hood of the car, and the highway stretched wide and empty in front of us. "Some things are worth the trouble," I said. And somewhere behind us, in a quiet house with a basement light still humming, my brother was already deciding what that trouble would cost. I kept the car steady at 60 miles per hour as the highway stretched ahead in a long ribbon of dark asphalt. The city lights grew brighter with every mile, glowing against the horizon like a quiet promise of normal life somewhere in the distance. Emily had been silent for several minutes now, her eyes following the passing trees and empty roadside signs that flickered through the headlights. The tension in her shoulders had softened slightly, but the way her hands rested tightly together in her lap told me she was still measuring every second carefully. When a person has spent days waiting for someone else to decide their fate, freedom feels unfamiliar at first. After about 10 minutes, she shifted slightly in her seat and glanced toward the dashboard clock. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice was steadier now, though it still carried a trace of uncertainty. "A place outside the city," I replied. "A small guest house I could keep for situations that require privacy." Emily studied my face for a moment, clearly weighing whether that answer made her safer or simply placed her deeper inside a world she had never intended to enter. Finally, she nodded slowly and returned her attention to the road ahead. The highway curved gently to the right, and the skyline appeared more clearly in the distance, tall buildings rising above the river like dark shapes against the glowing sky. "You said people might look for me," she said quietly after another minute. I nodded once. "Victor is careful," I said, "but he is also stubborn. If he believes you still represent a risk, he will try to control the situation again." Emily absorbed that without reacting outwardly. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small rectangular object about the size of a stick of gum. She held it between her fingers for a moment before placing it carefully on the center console between us. It was a simple black flash drive. I glanced at it briefly, then back at the road. "What is that?" I asked. Emily exhaled slowly. "Insurance," she said. The word carried more weight than she intended. When Victor brought me to the basement, I realized something quickly. If I only depended on promises, I would never leave that house. She looked at the flash drive again. So I kept the one thing he did not know I had. I reached over and picked it up, turning it slightly in the dashboard light. "And what exactly does your insurance contain?" Emily hesitated before answering. "The files from the warehouse, shipment records, financial ledgers, names." Her voice lowered slightly. "Everything I accidentally saw before he noticed me." I remained silent for several seconds as the highway lights flickered across the windshield. Victor had told the truth about one thing. She had seen something dangerous, something that involved people far beyond a simple warehouse on the South Docks. "Why keep it?" I asked finally. Emily looked at me directly. "Because if anything happens to me, someone needs to know the truth." The quiet certainty in her voice surprised me. She was not speaking like a victim anymore. She was speaking like someone who had already thought several moves ahead. I placed the flash drive back on the console. "You should not carry something like that openly," I said. She gave a small, tired smile. After 3 days in a basement, I decided hiding the truth was not working very well. The city lights grew brighter as we crossed the river bridge, and the hum of traffic slowly returned around us. Cars moved through the night in steady lines. People driving home from work, from dinners, from ordinary lives that had nothing to do with warehouses or hidden basements. Emily watched the skyline carefully as it came closer. "If your brother finds out I still have that," she said softly, "he will not stop looking." I kept my eyes on the road while the bridge carried us toward the glowing streets ahead. Then we will make sure he does not find you, I replied. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned back slightly against the seat and let out a slow breath that sounded like the first real breath she had taken all night. Outside the windshield, the city opened around us, bright and restless, and somewhere behind us my brother was likely beginning to realize that the situation he thought he controlled had already changed. I guided the car through the late-night traffic until the crowded city streets slowly faded into quieter neighborhoods where the buildings stood farther apart and the streetlights glowed softer against the pavement. The guest house sat at the end of a narrow private road about 20 minutes outside downtown, surrounded by tall oak trees that swayed gently in the cool air. When the headlights swept across the small brick building, Emily leaned slightly forward in her seat, studying the place carefully as though trying to decide if safety could really look this ordinary. I parked beside the front steps and turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the car felt almost unfamiliar after the steady hum of the road. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Emily looked down at the flash drive, still resting on the center console, and carefully picked it up, slipping it back in her jacket pocket. "Is this place yours?" she asked quietly. I nodded once. "It does not appear on any property records connected to my name." She seemed to understand what that meant without further explanation. We stepped out of the car, and the cool night air wrapped around us again, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves from the surrounding trees. The house itself was small compared to most of the places connected to my world, but that was exactly the point. No security gates, no cameras in obvious places, just a quiet porch and a single warm light glowing beside the door. Emily climbed the 2 wooden steps slowly and waited while I unlocked the door. When the lights flicked on inside, she paused in the entryway, taking in the simple furniture, the small kitchen table, the couch beside the window. The kind of place someone might rent for a quiet weekend without asking too many questions. "You can stay here for a few days," I said. "Long enough to rest and decide what you want to do next." She walked slowly into the living room, her eyes drifting across the shelves and the small lamp beside the couch, as if memorizing the layout of a place that did not feel like a prison. After a moment, she turned back toward me. "Your brother will figure out where you took me," she said softly. I leaned against the doorframe and considered that for a second. "Eventually," I replied. "Victor is persistent." Emily studied my expression carefully. "And when he does?" The question hung in the quiet room between us. I folded my arms loosely. "Then he will come talk to me." She let out a small breath that sounded halfway between disbelief and exhaustion. "You say that like it is simple." I allowed a faint smile. "Nothing involving my brother is simple." The clock on the wall ticked softly while the two of us stood there in the warm yellow light of the small house. Finally, Emily walked toward the window and looked out at the dark line of trees surrounding the property. "I used to think the worst thing that could happen was being in the wrong place at the wrong time," she said quietly. "But tonight, I realized something else." I waited. She turned slightly toward me, her expression thoughtful rather than frightened now. "Sometimes the right person finds you at the wrong moment." I considered the words for a second before answering. "Or the wrong moment forces the right decision." Emily nodded slowly, as if that explanation made a strange kind of sense. The wind outside rustled through the trees again, and the quiet house settled around us. For the first time since leaving the basement, there was no sound of chains, no footsteps echoing overhead, no sense that someone else controlled the next move. Just the quiet of a place where choices could finally belong to the person making them. Emily walked back toward the center of the room and stopped a few feet away from me. "You saved me tonight," she said simply. I shook my head slightly. I corrected a mistake. She studied me for a moment, then offered a small, tired smile. "That might be the same thing." I glanced toward the dark road outside the window where the night stretched calm and empty beyond the trees. Somewhere across the city, my brother was almost certainly already thinking 3 steps ahead, deciding how this unexpected turn would change his plans. But for the moment, none of that reached the quiet house at the end of the private road. And as the clock continued ticking softly on the wall, Emily Carter stood in the middle of the room, breathing freely for the first time in 3 days while the world outside waited to see what would happen next.